26 out of 40 engines from the same model line failed at the most expensive component on the motor. 65% failure rate. The brand that built them filed for bankruptcy 2 years later. That engine is still being sold today on the used market, and most buyers have no idea what they are looking at. I asked 25 marine mechanics which outboards they would never buy at any price, and 5 names came up over and over. The first one is the engine that destroyed an entire company, and we are starting there. Engine number 1, the Evinrude Ficht, 1998 and 1999 models. The 1998 and 1999 Evinrude Ficht 150 and 175 horsepower motors helped bankrupt Outboard Marine Corporation, and they did it in less than 2 years. The Ficht was supposed to be the future of two-stroke outboards, with cleaner emissions and better fuel economy through direct fuel injection technology adapted from automotive applications. OMC, the parent company of Evinrude and Johnson, bet the entire company on it. The bet failed catastrophically. The motors developed catastrophic ECU and injector failures at hour counts that should have still been considered new. One marine shop reported that of 40 Ficht 225 motors that came through their service bay, 26 had ECU failures. That is the 65% number we opened with. And the ECU is the most expensive single component on the entire motor. Customers were left with engines that would not start, would not hold idle, or would not exceed half throttle. Parts sat on backorder for months. Dealers refused returns. Repair bills frequently exceeded the value of the engines themselves, and many owners discovered that selling the boat for parts was cheaper than fixing the motor. OMC filed for bankruptcy in 2000. The Evinrude and Johnson brands were sold to Bombardier, ending nearly a century of independent operation for one of the most storied names in American marine manufacturing. A British marine mechanic who lived through the era summarized it on his industry blog by writing that the Ficht was the boat equivalent of a Ferrari, exciting when it worked and bankrupting you when it didn't. The lasting damage goes beyond the engines. The technical knowledge required to service them was concentrated in OMC dealerships that have since closed, rebranded, or been absorbed. The parts pipeline was never properly rebuilt after the bankruptcy. If you find a Ficht 150 or 175 from 1998 or 1999 on the used market at any price, even the mechanics willing to take the work on will warn you that diagnostic equipment and replacement components are increasingly difficult to source. The engine you save money on today becomes the engine you cannot fix 3 years from now. The next engine on the list carries a brand name that almost every boater trusts without question, and the problem is hidden inside the metal itself. Engine number 2, Yamaha Fezries, first generation, 2000 through 2007. Over 50% of the Yamaha F225 and F254 stroke outboards, built between 2000 and 2007, will eventually develop a manufacturing defect that costs $3,000 to $4,000 per engine to repair. That is not a guess. That is the estimate published by an industry contributor with extensive shop experience, and the mechanics who service these motors confirm the number every time the question comes up. The defect is in the dry exhaust passages running through the power head in the midsection, and mechanics across the industry simply call it the corrosion problem. The aluminum alloy used in this region of these engines corrodes from the inside out, where hot exhaust gases meet condensation and create an electrochemical reaction that gradually eats through the metal. There are no warning signs visible from the outside. The first symptom most owners see is milky oil on the dipstick, which means water has already breached the engine and the powerhead is often already compromised. Industry sources have documented that F225 models experienced severe corrosion failures after only 500 to 700 hours of operation, which on a recreational boat translates to roughly 5 to 7 seasons of moderate use. The corrosion appears on engines that were flushed religiously after every saltwater trip, on engines that lived their entire lives in freshwater, and on engines stored indoors with covers between trips. Maintenance does not prevent it. The defect is built into the metallurgy, and the engine consumes itself regardless of how well the owner takes care of it. The repair is brutal. The exhaust kit alone runs around $1,600 in parts. Including labor, the total typically lands between $3,000 and $4,000 per engine, which doubles for twin installations and triples for triples. Yamaha sold a repair kit for the problem, but coverage was limited to engines still under warranty, and the corrosion almost always presented after warranty expiration. The financial responsibility landed entirely with the owner. Mechanics who work on these motors say it plainly. With first-generation F-Series Yamaha's midsection corrosion is a question of when, not if. If you are buying used and you encounter an F-150, F-200, F-225, or F-250 from this era, the only safe approach is to assume the repair has not been done and negotiate the boat's price accordingly. The brand name on the cowling does not protect you from a defect. Yamaha never publicly acknowledged. A third engine on the list was supposed to be the most advanced two-stroke ever built, and it ended up shutting down a company that had built outboards for over 100 years. Engine number 3. Evinrude E-Tech G2. By 2020, BRP had shut down Evinrude production entirely. A brand that built outboards for over a century was discontinued. The E-Tech G2 was a major reason why. When Bombardier launched the G2 in 2014, it was marketed as the most advanced two-stroke outboard ever produced, with aggressive styling, relentless marketing, and a promise of reliability through technology the rest of the industry had abandoned for 4 strokes. The G2 was supposed to prove that 2 strokes still had a future. It promised 3 years between scheduled service visits and emissions cleaner than competing 4 strokes. What it actually delivered, according to mechanics who serviced it across multiple shops, was a pattern of failures that should not exist on a modern engine. Gearbox implosions on units with relatively low hours, blown power heads from causes that did not match any documented failure mode, parts that were impossible to source within reasonable timeframes. Commercial operators who bought the engines for fishing fleets reported their boats spent more time on land than on water during the first year of ownership. One charter operator described the experience as watching a slow-motion train wreck as engine after engine in his fleet failed in different ways for different reasons. A British marine mechanic who serviced the G2 extensively wrote that customers waited at the dock while owners stared down financial ruin, and that nobody he knew ran them commercially without experiencing some kind of breakdown. The technical complexity of the G2 made diagnosis difficult even for trained Evinrude technicians. With electronic systems that produced fault codes, the dealer network had no documented procedures for resolving. Software updates sometimes created new problems while attempting to fix old ones. When BRP shut down production in 2020, the company promised continued parts support. In practice, the parts availability for G2 models has been inconsistent, with mechanics reporting weeks-long waits for components that should be readily available from a manufacturer that supposedly still supports the line. The engines that are still running are running, but the support infrastructure is a fraction of what it was at launch. The resale market reflects the uncertainty by pricing G2 motors significantly below comparable Yamaha and Mercury units of the same era. Buying a G2 used today means accepting that future repairs may depend on parts availability nobody can guarantee. A fourth engine on the list cost $5,000 to repair every time one specific component failed, and the component was designed to fail. Engine number 4. First-generation Mercury Verado, 2005 and 2006 models. A single Verado supercharger replacement runs $5,000 new, or $3,400 refurbished. One Mercury owner reported both superchargers on his triple Verado installation failing within hours of each other at 900 hours of operation. The repair bill was catastrophic on its own, and it was the moment he realized he had bought into a system that could not be maintained at any reasonable cost. The original Mercury Verado launched in 2004 as the first supercharged inline 6-4-stroke outboard. 650 pounds of precision engineering bolted to the back of a boat. When it ran, it was genuinely impressive, and the supercharger gave the engine a power character competitors could not match for nearly a decade. The supercharger was also the source of the most expensive problems any modern Mercury has produced. Mercury issued multiple service bulletins addressing supercharger system failures, including the well-known Service Bulletin 2015-08, which covers supercharger end cap failures, isolator boot tears, sensor boot failures, drive pin bushing wear, and oil leak issues at the supercharger bearing housing. The 2005 first-year Verados had a documented oil squirter block design that capped horsepower output and was eventually replaced in later production runs. End caps would rattle as the bushings wore out. The supercharger would eventually seize if the rattle was ignored. The engine would either enter Guardian mode or refuse to run entirely, while the rest of the motor sat in perfect condition behind the failed accessory. The 2005 and 2006 first-generation Verados in particular accumulated such a long list of service bulletins that experienced Mercury-certified mechanics now flagged them as the highest-risk used Verados available on the market. Later generations of the Verado, particularly the V8 generation introduced in 2018, have a substantially cleaner record and have earned positive reviews from the same mechanics who refused to work on the early units. The boat shopper who finds a 2005 or 2006 Verado at a price that looks too good to refuse should remember that the price reflects what the previous owner already learned about supercharger replacement bills. The final engine on the list was so universally bad that no manufacturer wanted to keep building it, even though 3 different companies tried. Engine number 5. Chrysler and Force Outboards, 1970S through 1990S. The Force 150 horsepower 5-cylinder was subject to a recall for breaking the crankshaft below the flywheel during normal cruising. The failure mode was described by one user as the engine throwing a heavy steel frisbee through the cowling for the operator to catch. That is the kind of safety incident that would shut down a modern manufacturer entirely. At the time, it was treated as a routine service bulletin. If you ask any marine mechanic over the age of 50 which outboards they would not buy at any price, Chrysler and Force will appear on the list within seconds, often accompanied by a story about a specific repair that ended a customer's relationship with boating entirely. The engines were so universally bad that the brand was passed across multiple manufacturers. West Bend originally produced them. Chrysler took over. The line was rebranded as Force. Mercury bought the manufacturing rights and continued building them under the Force name through the early 1990s, before quietly discontinuing the line. A British marine mechanic with decades of experience described the Chrysler 105 horsepower as having 3 standout features: an ignition system that did not like to do the ignition bit, a power head that would seize up just because it felt like it, powerhead bolts positioned by someone who clearly hated mechanics. The engines were built to a price point that prioritized manufacturing cost over service economics, with components difficult to access, fasteners that corroded into permanent fixtures, and a parts ecosystem that began deteriorating before the brand was fully discontinued. These engines were cheap when new. They remain cheap on the used market because experienced mechanics know better than to take them on. Parts availability deteriorates each year as the technicians who knew how to work on them retire, and aftermarket suppliers stop producing replacement components. If you see a vintage Chrysler or Force on a hull you are otherwise interested in, the engine is best understood as a discount applied to the price of the boat, with the assumption that you will eventually need to repower or walk away from the project entirely. The cost of repowering with a modern outboard often exceeds the value of the boat itself, which is why so many of these hulls sit unsold for years with the same engines bolted to the transom. Every engine on this list followed the same script: sold with confidence, supported through a warranty period that masked the underlying problem, failed in the hands of customers who had already paid. The FICT, the first-generation Yamaha F-Series, the E-Tech G2, the early Verado, and the Chrysler Force lineage each tell a different version of the same story, where engineering ambition outpaced execution and the customer ended up serving as the unintentional test fleet while the mechanics inherited the cleanup. The good news for buyers is that mechanics talk to each other. Forums document failures permanently. Service bulletins survive on the internet for anyone willing to look for them. The information about which engines to avoid is freely available to anyone willing to spend an hour searching before they spend $20,000 buying. The boat owners who manage to avoid these motors are not lucky. They are simply paying attention to a knowledge base that has always been public. The next time you stand in front of a used outboard and the price seems too good to be true, run the model and the year through marine technician forums before you make an offer. The engines that mechanics quietly warn each other about are often the same engines that show up on dealer lots with discounts that look like opportunities. The discounts are there because the people who actually work on these motors already know what is coming. The only person at the transaction without that information is the buyer who did not check. If this was useful, hit subscribe. I cover the engines, the brands, and the maintenance truths that the marine industry would prefer you discover only after you have already paid.